One of the fringe benefits of this that I had not thought of before is that the fact of my coming in and my goosing you about the marriage may well make it possible for her to change some of her inside feelings about men, to change the process of her mother's having trained her. It was a very nice experience for me. I hurt, and yet as the consultant, I could hurt and still move on. Whereas your hurt is such that it's very hard to move. You know, you empathize, you respond to her so closely, so personally, that it's very hard for you to push, to confront more powerfully. And yet, as I confront more powerfully, I open the thing up for you so that you can hopefully be more available as a man in her fantasies. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we are roles doesn't mean that we are not available for very powerful transference factors. And I was teasing her about that, but in the teasing, respecting it, both in terms of her transference and your counter-transference, or co-transference, which I think is a better term. Because I think when we transfer to patients, we're just like patients transferring to us. It's the same kind of process.
I've wondered that. I've wondered at times, particularly in the last 6 weeks, if I've gotten a little bit enmeshed to the point there was something missing in what I was doing because of this enmeshment with Mom, if you will.
Well, I think you need to be enmeshed. Somebody back through the years, I don't know who it was, Malone maybe, coined a term acting in, which is the opposite of acting out. It means to intensify the relationship rather than avoid it or play aloof and distant from it. And I think the fact that you got them for the consultation is, for me at least, a big compliment to your guts, but also an evidence of your awareness that you were overinvested, just like she's overinvested in the kids. And the fact that she's overinvested is inevitable. You know, here she's lost the two men of significance in her life within the last couple of years. That's massive, you know. Even if you only speak of them as ridiculous, one drunk and one cancer victim, they're still the men that she transferred to, whether they were adequate or impotent. And the answer to that is that you let yourself act in, you let yourself move in closer and closer, and then you get somebody else to help you protect yourself from over-investing yourself past the point of being useful. And that's what I think consultation's all about. And my own belief is that that should happen in every second interview. That what we did this morning is the way to make it possible for you to invest yourself at the depth that you can afford and they can use, because you belong to another generation. You know, because you are her mother and I am her father in this foster father game. And that because I'm attached to you, you aren't the therapist, we will now be the therapist. For real, by gosh. You know, if this gets hot again, get me on the telephone. You know, and you and I'll have an interview with the speaker telephone and them there. I'll goose her again. I think it's a real privilege that we had such an abnormally normal family. You know, this family is in a stage of massive abnormality, but it's a normal, healthy family. With all the normal, healthy variants that families are heir to, that time and life stick us all with. What to say about it from my side? I guess I see it as a very kind of sacred privilege, being able to be the consultant, being able to move so deeply into this kind of a life, to be able to suffer with them. And the problem that we suffer with, that you and I suffer with, is how to do that and move out. How to not go home with that. How to leave that in the office. How to leave that with the family. And to me, the concept of the foster parent is one of the great sewage, one of the big sewer pipes, you know, that all this pain of mine can flow down, is that concept of being a foster parent. And the other one is, to me, the difference between psychotherapy, which is thinking about life, and living, which is what they're doing. And the big, what are these things outside the castle? You know, the big water, I can't hear the word, but you know what I mean. Moat. The big moat is the difference between the thinking time and living. Like she said, I don't agree with you that this is suicidal. I don't care whether she agrees with me or not. That's not the issue. I owe her my conviction, my belief system. And I feel very free, not happy, but free to let her decide about her belief system. I have no intention, would have no intention, were I to see her again, to find out whether she has changed her belief system. I only want her to know about mine, that I think she's suicidal, that I think her husband died of cancer because he was getting back at himself, that I think her father died of cancer because he was getting back at himself. And that doesn't make any difference what she believes. But the psychotherapy is the place where I try to expose myself, not make them expose themselves. And that to me is a very different kind of territory. The process of the Frisbee, in my practicing office over this 20 years of seeing only families, I accumulated so many puzzles, teddy bears, Frisbees, batakas, that the place looked like a mess, like my garage. But to have a family with two psychotics, whom I've been seeing once a week for weeks and weeks, months, come in and spend the entire hour playing with 3 or 4 Frisbees off the walls and nobody saying a word. That to me is kind of an ideal interview. Because they're already dominated by their panic. And if they can transcend it even for an hour, if they can enjoy living without at least bugging each other with the horror. To me, that gives them access to a new level of freedom. Where would I go next time? Were I there next time? Nowhere. I would sit very carefully, very quietly, and wait. I would be very clear that I have no right to find out where they are with their life. I have no right to find out what I accomplished with them. That my job is only the process of psychotherapy, has nothing to do with progress. Progress is what they do with their life, and it belongs to them, just like, well, I wasn't going to mention Nicaragua, but just like any country has a right to its own life. Each family has a right to its own life. And if you try to take it over, I think you not only double-cross them, you double-cross yourself. Because I don't think anybody can live a real life on somebody else's belief system. We have a nice, God, we have a solid hour. And for God's sakes, don't ask simple questions, you know. Push the hell out of me. And maybe even more simple.
Why did you decide to introduce the Frisbee when you did?
I have no idea. I brought it, and after I got here, I was very sad that I hadn't brought anything else. Because I usually take 2 or 3 or 4 things of one sort or another. It was clear that I wanted it. I didn't know there were any children there. So part of the reason I brought it along in this colored bag that made it invisible, which happened to be in the room where I was living, was because I thought maybe it wouldn't be needed. You know, maybe we wouldn't use it. Somebody was going to save it for me, and I kept that. Then when it turned out we had kids, of course, it was an obvious thing. And it just occurred to me, this is part of the use of the right brain. There's nothing so unimportant that you ought to keep it out. Now, I don't know whether the unimportant thing was not thinking about it earlier or thinking about it then. I don't know. It's like any other spontaneity. Like the 2 or 3 crazy bits I had. I always, I evaluate the usefulness of the interview by the amount of craziness I find in myself. And it's a nice compliment to you guys, this business of the moat and the sewage disposal of the anxiety of the interview. Those are both things I've never thought of before. And it makes the forenoon worthwhile. That's what I come here for. I don't come here for you guys.
I had a crazy thought about possibly Mom being an incest victim and holding on to her grief with her parents and husband partially because of that.
That's a very nice issue. It never occurred to me, and that may of course have to do with my being born in 1912 and you know, my mother, well anyway, we weren't talking. But I think if you had been there and had that thought, my thinking is you should have said it just like that. And it might have been a tremendously powerful experience for her, whether it was true or not, or whether it was true in fantasy and not in reality. I had the thought when she said she started gaining weight that she was 17, that may have had to do with a sexual episode, and I decided not to mention it. I don't know why, because it's very unusual for me to decide not to do something. But long as we left it hanging. You see, the important thing is not that I find out. The important thing is that I leave her cooking with something that may come back to her in a valuable way.
I was wondering about the difference as you delineate between consultation and ongoing therapy. Could you structure some ways that you might have intervened differently were you the ongoing therapist? And another part of a second question, I guess, to be truthful, is I've read where you said that the two most important skills or tools a therapist have are their own inconsistency and craziness. And could you just elaborate more than what that one sentence says?
Yeah. I should have made you let me answer the first one before the second one. Say it again for me, will you? I've forgotten it already.
You can choose the order. I'll just ask one at a time. You're not supposed to ask more than once anyway. I just didn't think I could get up here again.
You're doing well.
I'm doing okay. Grab one.
I'm over being scared, so I'm ready to go ahead.
Right. Oh, okay. Like they said in the plenary, the first giggle. My question was, that as you contrast consultation and ongoing therapy, could you say just a few hypotheses of how you might have intervened differently were you the ongoing therapist?
Yeah. I think the ongoing therapist has to have his affect, his anesthesia, precede the knife. So it's much slower. In this case, we had a general anesthetic, so I could move freely without worrying about drawing too much blood, leaving too much pain. The same thing is true in the first interview. You can meet with a family in the first interview and go wild in your history taking. You can do all sorts of things. You can have your paranoia just spill all over the place. You can't do that again, because if you start asking, was your mother an incest victim in the second interview, they have a whole mass of reverberations to that. What did I say in the first interview? What did mother say? Did mother talk to him on the telephone? But the first interview, you're a free agent. You can deal almost like I was able to. But were I the therapist, I would have inched very slowly. I would not have been able to have the kind of freedom and the kind of cutting edge that I could use very freely. The other one, the importance of inconsistency and craziness. I think the two therapists, if we're talking about co-therapy now, this is really consultation, which is kind of like co-therapy, except co-therapy is ongoing. If you see a family and you think, this is too much for me, I think you ought to say to them, I think this is too much for me. I will have to have somebody with me. It will cost you twice as much. And so you come once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or however you can afford it. But I don't want to fail. I would rather have 2 people and have you come half as often and hope for success. Now the 2 therapists to me are like the mother and father. And I don't think there's any way of, at least in my experience, and that's all I can talk about, of course, I don't think there's any way of defining who has what role, because I think it frequently varies by the minute. I think the only thing that's important is that the 2 not try to be consistent. That if mother doesn't dare say anything for fear father would think it was not the right thing to say, then neither one is being a human being. They're both being role models and fakes in the eyes of the other. So the two therapists need to have the kind of respect that makes them free to be all that they are. To the patient then, to the family then, the relationship of the family is to us, not to him, not to me. And the us relationship, like the two-person parent set, is tremendously important, because when the child relates to a mother and father who know they're going to be more important than either kid, he's free to move away and move back. And that's real growth. Individuating and belonging. And the more you individuate, the more you can belong, and the more you belong, the more you can individuate. But if it's an equilateral triangle like Freud talked about, you're in trouble. Because then you've got all the problems of the triad, the teaming, the Oedipal stuff. But if it's a real relationship, then the Oedipal stuff is always as if. Daughter goes out with her father to her freshman high school dance, and mother isn't jealous. Sonny takes mom out to a rock concert, and daddy is tickled at this playing between mother and son at being husband and wife.
The camera wasn't on the therapist at the time the mother gave a marriage proposal, so I couldn't see his reaction, but perhaps he could speak to that, and Dr. Whitaker, what you might have to say to him in getting that proposal.
This is a good example of something that I think is a real privilege of the consultant. You know, I can take her fantasy and his fantasy, which I assume is present and very well covered, or maybe not even present, and play with it like it was for real, just like I could play with the business of her being married to these two little boys, and at the same time play at these two little boys being her mother. That's one of the privileges of the consultant, that you can move into these territories which look ridiculous, but are very deeply real in the transference problem, in the fantasies, in the covert understructure. And very real. I think they're very powerful. I had a schizophrenic whose therapist got divorced. And she called me, I'd been a consultant in it, saying she thought he was getting a divorce so he could marry her. And I was lucky enough, and the situation was such that I could invite him in and her in and tell him that I believed she was right. I didn't think he would marry her, but that I assumed that she was right in suspecting that he'd gotten a divorce in hopes that he could marry her. Because it might have helped him learn how to be crazy, and he wasn't very good at it. But I think those kind of things, those way out fantasies, are where life really is. You know, we're really all schizophrenics. The trouble is, most of us are only schizophrenic in the middle of the night when we're sound asleep, and we wake up and make believe nothing happened.
Would you speak to the importance of the grandmother continuing as a part of the therapy? If I heard correctly, I believe this was the first time that she had been in.
Yeah.
And it seems like that you, I should say, maybe gave her the opportunity to assume a very important role, and she certainly is a part of the mythology, or the leader of it.
Yeah, boy. I think the critical thing to me is to have everybody in on the first interview. I think the big system is in charge of the nuclear family. The extended family rules. So I would be, if I were setting it up over the telephone like I would like to, like we do now with the family reunion, I would make sure not only that Grandma was there for the first interview, but that the other daughter and her husband and those kids, like the other grandmother and the other grandfather, and the brothers and sisters of that father, would all be there for that first interview, or anybody I could possibly con into coming or threaten into coming. At this stage, to me, the member of the extended family is a consultant to the therapist. The job the therapist has to try to help this family get more out of life, which is what all therapy is about, as I think of it. She becomes then the consultant. The question of her coming back to me is something I respectfully leave to mother and the children. Would say to them, you know, I don't think as a therapist I'm very good as a new man for this mother. I don't think it's fair of her to have to be the mother and the father and the grandmother and the grandfather to these kids. But I reserve your right to decide who comes back the next time. I wanted your mother here this time as a consultant to me, to help me do a better job. And I would love to have her back anytime you feel that you could stand her being here, or that she would be helpful to me or helpful to you. I do not want her as a patient. I don't think that's what it's all about.
Yeah, a lot of what you said during the session made me feel very uncomfortable. Yet, at the end, I felt very sort of warm and compassionate about the session. And especially a lot of what you said in terms of generalizations about men and women at times made me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But yet, at the same time, it seemed to be balanced. I mean, I didn't see you as bashing either gender, or being nice to either gender as compared to bad to either gender. And a struggle that I'm presently struggling with, an issue I'm presently struggling with, is this whole issue of, does the end justify the means? And because I work with similarly very, very difficult cases which have failed with everybody else down the line throughout the entire mental health system, and at that point they are failures. I mean, at life, and they're a dead family, basically. So it almost seems like radical surgery, using your metaphor, is indicated. Yet, so sometimes I'm feeling like the end does justify the means, but yet in the present milieu of our field, this is a very uncomfortable thing to think about saying. And so I don't think that all ends justify all means by any means, but is there a place in our field for sometimes certain ends do justify certain means, even though they may be sexist in variety? And can you comment about that, please?
Well,
about your own personal feelings.
That's a well-taken position, and I like the way you talk about it. And I guess I need to be clear that I'm talking about me, and I wouldn't want you to play me and get your throat cut in court. I believe that all family therapy is like oncology surgery. That the family is always in severe pain. There's no such thing as a uni-symptom family. They're all multiple symptom. And there's no such thing as a non-painful family life. It's all painful. And I would rather be called cruel than youthful, because I think if you don't invade their world, you might as well stay home. That they can do any of the reasonable, ordinary stuff, and have. I guess the reason I feel I don't know. The reason I justify myself is because I think I really do care. I think the problem we struggle with is the intellectual one, or the academic one, of are we doing it because we don't care? And I don't think that's true of us. I think anybody who gets into this racket has got to be a caring person, or they're going to find another way to earn a living. It's ridiculous to spend your life suffering with other people's pain unless you're really alive to your own pain. I think the justification for a lot of the freedom that I have comes from having been a patient. And I think I wouldn't want to be in therapy with anybody who's never been a patient, because I think that's operating in bad faith. But I think you also must realize that you're first, not the patient. If you do the thing that mothers sometimes do, I keep laughing at the airplane people who say the mother should put the gas mask or the oxygen thing over the baby first, or themselves. I'm a man, I'll never know. That they should do it over themselves first and the baby second, and I think, you know, if you don't set that up in a better way, you're never going to win, because there's no mother that would do it to herself first and the baby second. That's just not mothers, as I think of mothers. Never been one, but I'd love to be. That's my plan. You know, if God turns it over to me, I'm going to have the man have the second baby. The business of the gender thing, again, I say my own belief in the gender thing. I think men are hopeless. I think they're just utterly hopeless. And it's my belief. Just like I think women are hypnotists, just like, you know, this woman was hypnotized by her mother, and she's hypnotizing these kids, and it's wonderful and horrible, just like anything else in life, I guess. I say it with a lot of pain and with a lot of panic, I guess. But don't forget, you come first. If you cut your throat, there are a hell of a lot of families that won't get any help. And the other one, I think, is somehow to become satisfied with not being omnipotent. You know, I can remember back in the Atlanta Psychiatric Clinic days when we were questioning ourselves. We had this 3-4 hour session, the 8 of us. What are your assumptions about psychotherapy? Do you think if we were good enough as psychotherapists, we could get a patient to regrow an amputated leg? This is no joke. This is dead serious. And we went through a lot of stuff just like that. And I think we need to face some of those. Some parts of our belief system are pretty damn crazy. And like I spent 12 years working with chronic schizos, and I could get them well. I believe it's just psychological. But what I discovered after I invested all this thousands of hours is they'd go home and 6 weeks later be crazy as hell again. So I decided I would never again see a schizophrenic by himself. It had to be the family. And it's not very successful there either, but that's my inadequacy, our inadequacy.
I'm intrigued by the issue of leaving a client a piece of yourself, other than the words that you say or the thoughts they provoke. Now, you've directed this family not to discuss the issues for 48 hours. You have one child who's holding your handkerchief, another child who's holding your Frisbee. My question is, had you had more items with you, would you have left the mother something and the grandmother something?
Probably not. It's rare for me to do that. I would not have done it on purpose, did not do it on purpose. I do it only if it comes free associatively. As I left the room this morning, Muriel said, "You want this white handkerchief when I'm packing?" And I said, "Oh, sure." And no thought about any use for it, except to clean my glasses. I rarely carry it. But we'd been talking about crying, and I assume that's where the idea popped into my head. I had no thought of giving the Frisbee away when I arrived. I don't ordinarily do that. I have 50 of them at home. I got fluked into, I ordered 200. And when this teaching thing I was doing up in Gabriola Island, and 150 came the one day, and I sold all those to the gang. And then 50 arrived the next day, and they were all gone, so I had 50 to take home. And I believe in them. I think of this as part of the other side of surgery. I was suddenly remembering when I was an OB surgeon, going in the next morning and fluffing up mother's pillow and offering her some lipstick or some way of getting her back to looking like a human being instead of a body.
When you were
Wasn't
talking...
that nice of him? I thought
it was
men were
really.
Always, yeah, men are supposed to take it away from women nowadays, but go ahead.
And I thanked him.
Oh,
Yes.
nice of you.
When you were talking about the children leaving home, you said something like riding off into the, and I waited for sunset, and then you said rainstorm and something else to do with water. And I thought how lovely, instead of saying ride off into death, cry, not die. I'm checking that out to see if that's what you were thinking too.
I have no idea what I was thinking. I thought of the sunset and thought, that's crazy. And then this other thing came to me. And I guess it came to me because I think of these kids as facing a stormy, stormy life. And I worry about it. I fret with it. I guess that's part of the same issue somebody brought up a moment ago about sharing my own world. I do the same thing. I share real fragments of my life whenever they pop into my head. I assume there's a level of communication between them and me which I'm not aware of and they're not aware of, but if it comes up where I can catch it, I want to throw out that psychological Frisbee in hopes that it'll land where it'll be useful to them.
Thank you.
I rather agree with you about men being behind in terms of liberation. I'm helpless. I would have never pushed her over. In any event, I wanted to talk to you just a moment about if you thought at all about what you represented to each one of those people in that family. I sort of saw myself maybe trying to work with them, and it seemed that you made a perfect husband for the grandmother, and maybe a good father for the mother of the two children, and maybe a real good grandfather for both of the grandchildren. And I'm just wondering if that was more a function of your appearance or...
I don't know. The business of winking at grandmother was interesting. Because when they were doing all this setting up of this stuff, and there were all these people in front of her, I suddenly caught a glimpse of her through somebody's elbow and winked. And she didn't wink back. I didn't think of myself in terms of this model that you're talking about. I thought of him in terms of that model, and I certainly thought of them in terms of she should know enough about how to train men to find one who's trainable. Incidentally, a new thought for me. I've not thought of that as a response to this business of what women are going to do about us gruesome characters who know nothing except how to fight or send up satellites or psychological series. Muriel spent 49 years and 2 months and 5 days. And she's not made me into a human being. I'm more competent as a human being than I was 50 years ago. And I think most of it's due to her. But, I go to New York City, where I spent 2 years as an OB/GYN resident, and where she went to high school, in the Columbia University setting, and she revels in the beauty of the Manhattan scene. And it's just so ridiculous. What I think about how in the hell can they get all those electrical circuits, all that gas pipe, water pipe, sewer pipe, support for those huge buildings? It's just crazy. It's like I don't see the beauty, all I see is the mechanics. Let's have my head examined.
One last comment, if I could. Yesterday in your session, you had a metaphor about baseball and the Red Sox and the Mets and joining and rooting them on. I just want you to know it helped in about the bottom of the 10th last night. Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope they'll win tonight.
Dr. Whitaker, I know you're the star of the show here, but I'm interested in what this guy next to you has to say. Good, I was hoping you'd do that, because I'm interested in, I don't know what your name is, I came in a little bit late.
Glenn.
Okay, Glenn. A little bit about what was going on with you in the session. I'm sure this has been on videotape or is being videotaped, and we all laughed at one point. You'll probably see that when you look at it, where it showed you and Dr. Whitaker together, and he had said something, and I can't remember what it was, and you had a very scowling look on your face, and we all laughed. And I think maybe a lot of people were wondering what was going on with you during the session. You were in there, but we didn't hear anything from you, and and you didn't collaborate right together on this in the beginning. And I just wonder what that was like for you, not saying anything yourself, but I'm sure you had some feelings.
After the initial anxiety attack for the first 30 minutes, I really got into this listening and how Dr. Whitaker interwove things and went from this person to that person, and I don't know, it's just experience, and I really kind of cherish it.
There's another answer to that. If he had been my consultant, it would have happened the same way in reverse. I would have sat and listened, and he would have had the smart ideas. And you may not believe that, but I tell you it's true. That the caring person doesn't think. And the person who has somebody else who will do the caring is free to think. And the problem is that if you're a solo therapist, it's very hard to ever learn how to think, and it's very hard to ever get enough freedom from being overwhelmed by the fact that this is you're talking to, not somebody else. Do some psychodrama sometime and see what happens to you. You know, you may think you're acting a part. It turns out that you're up to your ears.
Something that struck me as you were talking to the kids is that you used adjectives instead of behaviors for them. Maybe that's not too clear. You told the kids and the mother they had permission to be mean to one another. And I thought, wow, here's two children that have been physically abused by someone, physical abuse being intergenerational, and social learning theory saying that catharsis is no good anymore. What happens after something like that if a lot of aggression starts to spill out from these children as a result of that? And how would the ongoing therapist deal with that to re-divert it into a pattern that would be functional?
Well, I wouldn't want to re-divert it. Why would you want to re-divert it?
Well, I'm thinking if it had been me saying something like that, I would have said, you probably feel a lot of anger now and you probably want to do mean things, but you must be careful not to hurt the people in your family. And what if little brother comes and tortures the cat he gave big brother? You know, something of that nature that needs to be dealt with.
I wouldn't be apt to deal with it. I think the problem of social adaptability, the problem of living, is very different from the problems of therapy. I'm not interested in the progress, I'm only interested in the process. I'm only interested in how I can do a better job at pushing them into their way of living. I'm not trying to decide how they're going to live. I'm not interested in the culture's relationship to them or their relationship to the culture. I'm interested in their relationship to themselves and their freedom to be all of whom they are. My assumption is that if you, or that as I okayed their being mean, that took it out of the category of being a character distortion into the category of being a functional game. And that I think mother ought to be mean to her mother. I think the kids ought to be mean to their mother. I didn't say it, but I think mother should have hit her husband in the back of the head with a brick. I would have defended her in court as a crime of passion. But that has nothing to do either, except with my fantasy. The facts of her life are what they are. I try not to take the social, cultural bond into the interview. I think the interview is a place where you think, not a place where you evaluate society.
Let us assume for a moment that you have anesthetized us with respect to the profound respect that you treated this family with, and with the awe with which we recognize your talent and skill as a clinician and your position in the field, and that we are ready for some surgery. What kind of surgery would you like to operate upon among the therapists you see in the field at the moment? In other words, what kinds of cancers do you see in the field which you would like to excise?
Nice, very nice. I guess the one that you just heard is one of them. I'd like to excise the probation officer in each of you. Unless you're hired as a probation officer, an executive disciplinary control person, that doesn't belong to you. If you're hired, then you ought to be the probation officer, you ought to be the control expert, then you shouldn't try to be a therapist. I think if you're going to be a therapist, the other thing I'd like to excise is the spillover that happens at 5 o'clock. I would like each of you to have a cuddle group so you could curse and swear and exult before you leave the office and never tell your spouse about the affairs you had during the day. Because I think the professional training, the professional role structure belongs in the office. And God protect me from a dedicated amateur. Some make it. Mother Teresa made it. I've known a few others who make it, who give their lives to the professional world. I think it's a very expensive project. They were a wonderful guy. He's next to me in the office in Madison, Wisconsin during my 20 years in the medical school there. And Dick Anderson was a pediatrician for 15 years, and then he went and got psychiatric training. That didn't make him a psychiatrist. He's still a pediatrician. He just had psychiatric training. And he's a dedicated old bachelor. And you know, I've never gotten to work before he did. He's in the children's ward checking up on some kid who had diarrhea last night. And I've never stayed as long as he does. At 8 o'clock at night, he's back up on the ward checking up on some other baby. And it's wonderful. And I'd love to be a mother that he was pediatrician to. You know, I'd love to be a mother anyway. But there aren't many of those people, and I think you need to be careful. I think you can only be a good professional if you can be clear that you're working at it. It's a role, not yourself. What else?
Perhaps along those lines, one of the concerns that I had was for the oldest child who was already in a real caretaking position with his mother. I got concerned at the thought of their being mean and wondered if he would take it on himself to try to get Mom to lose 100 pounds. I wondered if you could comment how you might deal with that either in the future or if at all.
Oh, I'm glad to dump him with that, because I think that's the same thing we're talking about. If I say to him, you know, if I was your mother, I would be very upset that you were very angry at me for dying like this. But that's a role. You see, that's my fantasy. And my fantasy isn't going to haunt him. There'll come a point 6 weeks down the road, 3 months down the road, when I say, oh, enough of that baloney. So I think you can change the character destruction into a function, and then the function can be eliminated. Just like if you get a kid like this who's holding mother's hand, you know, he thinks it's for her, he knows it's for her, she thinks it's for him. You know. So you tell him, like Jay Haley's prescribing the symptom. You know, I think you ought to rub your mother's back for 5 minutes before breakfast every morning. And just as soon as she comes back from work, you ought to make her lie down on the couch and you ought to rub her back and her neck. And you ought to do that every day, twice a day. Great, you know. Good for her, good for him. But he'll get sick of it, you know. Or she won't tolerate it. And then you've broken the pathology, which is building at a great rate. He doesn't know he's her husband. But I can laugh about it. And 6 weeks later, he can remember it and say, huh?
I'd be curious to hear some more about how you get out of it being in this caring mode and how one can learn how to feel comfortable being mean simultaneously with being caring. I mean, that's a dilemma that I find myself getting ensnared in frequently.
Sure.
And
it's really very easy, just 40 years of doing the same damn thing.
what have you learned in 40 years?
How to be less a victim. Not completely, because I can still cut my throat in the same way I did it in 1938, when I was very upset about raising my prices from $3 an hour to $5 an hour. I think the pathology is still there. I think we'll always be super moms, whatever we try. But I think there comes a point where you're a little less victimized by it, just because it's gone on so many times.
As a student of psychology, I guess what I grapple with is how I know what I'm doing is right. I sometimes wonder, is what I'm saying right? Is I doing, is it okay? And I sit in awe when I watch you, how you use yourself as such a beautiful therapeutic tool. And I'm wondering, what is it that you did to evolve to this point? How did you learn to come and trust yourself so well?
That's wonderful. I can tell you bits and pieces of it. Part of it is that I never had any training. Yeah, that's really not a joke. You know, I lucked into a ladder in I finished my OBGYN residency in 1938, and I came back to Syracuse to find a place to practice OB, and I thought I'd case the joint from the psychopathic hospital, where I'd get a fellowship for a year. I fell head over heels in love with schizophrenia. And then I decided I had to find out how people got crazy, and I got a child psychiatry fellowship, and went to Louisville, was assigned to Louisville, and all of a sudden I was told, you will be teaching psychiatry. Well, anybody who knows obstetrics obviously could teach psychiatry. But anybody who knew anything about it was overseas. We had a world war going on, you know. So here was this kid who was suddenly trying to keep ahead of the medical students to teach them psychiatry. And that's happened all the way along. I did 20 years of group therapy with the gang of us in Atlanta, made every medical student have 2 years of group therapy, whether he liked it or not. And the first time I ever was a member of a group in group therapy was when I moved to Madison 20 years later and had to go to group therapy because I got 3 speeding tickets. I never had a mentor. I moved from this child psychiatry thing into 3 years with delinquents, which they just decided could use as psychotherapists. And then for 2 years at Oak Ridge with 75,000 people who were locked in trying to make something that we thought was the front end of horses to be sent to Washington for final assembly. And then all of a sudden I was chairman of psychiatry. I didn't know anything about psychiatry, and here I was running a department. I didn't know anything about the department either. So that a great deal of what happened, nobody ever told me what was right and wrong. I'm still doing what's wrong and don't know the difference. And I don't think there's any way of knowing what's right. Society tells you what's right. I think they're a bunch of liars. Our mothers tell us what's right, and that comes out of her phobias. I don't know any way of knowing it. I think you need to take responsibility for what you do. For instance, I think one of the simplest things to do is to say in the middle of the first interview, you know, Dad, I just had the strangest feeling that you're a cold fish. And I just felt I ought to tell you, I don't have any idea whether it's because you remind me of my grandfather, who was kind of a cold fish, or a patient I saw a year ago. He killed himself. But I thought you ought to know, so you ought to be suspicious of me because of this funny way I see you. Or maybe you just are a cold fish, I don't know. So you move with yourself and take responsibility for the fact that you may be very wrong, but they have to judge that. You can't judge yourself. That's impossible.
I'm a student, and I'm tempted to try to answer this question.
Don't do it then.
For myself,
No,
but I really want to know what you do. If that abusive father were still living and were still abusive and was sitting there with that family, what kind of craziness could you apply to him, and would you impose more restraint upon yourself?
No, I probably would not restrain myself. I would have wondered who beat him up to teach him that that was the way you handle things that are too big for you. I would have asked him why it was that he let his wife make him into the man next door instead of forcing him into being the father to his children, and why he let her get away with marrying the 2 kids when he was still around, and that I would undoubtedly have gone to this thing that I really revel in, of I really think she ought to hit you in the back of the head with a brick, and I will be very glad to go to court and defend her if she does it. And I think a blow in the back of the head with a brick from a woman is just as powerful as from a man. And I don't understand why women are so stupid that they love men so much that they let them get away with murder like your wife is letting you get away with.
Could I invite you to continue your surgery on us? You did invite us to ask you difficult questions, and I am asking you to try to recall those kinds of things that you've seen in your experience, where you've seen other clinicians do things that you felt were counter-therapeutic, and the kinds of things that you think that we as clinicians could perhaps benefit from in terms of examining ourselves more carefully.
Yeah. I think the co-therapy thing to me is the most powerful. To have a peer, not as a superior who you're then going to copy, but a peer with whom you try to learn together. So that when one of you moves, the other one has a chance to back off and think and wonder and question, but the clear recognition that no 2 people see anything the same. We don't see the world the same way, but that you have no capacity, no possible way of knowing what the other person sees, what his life does in response to this thing in front of the 2 of you. I'm not even sure it makes any difference whether you talk about it before and after. I think it's very important that you be there together. I think the business of never being a single parent in the psychotherapy set, of always having somebody who, with whom you question yourself, preferably, I really think preferably, in front of whoever it is that's involved. For example, I assume that the thing that happened with us this morning, that my teasing her about marrying him, was a direct involvement or invasion, if you will, of his fantasy as well as hers. That kind of thing I think you ought to have all the time. I remember Dave Keith, my most esteemed colleague, and I saw a couple for quite a while, really. And at the end of the therapy, when they said goodbye, I said, that's some woman. She is really tremendous. She makes me vibrate every time she shows up. He said, I didn't have that at all. I've never recovered. I have the feeling, how could he have sat through that thing and not echoed like I echoed? But it leaves me with some suspicion of my echoing. And I think that kind of process. The other one is a series of consultants. Because of my not having any training, when I got this weird job of being chairman, knowing nothing about nothing, I got these other gang together, Malone and Workington and Felder, and we ran the department as a group of peers, and we moved in and out of each other's therapy with the greatest nonchalance. The second interview was always with a consultant in, and whoever the consultant happened to have a free hour at the same hour we had the next appointment. So that it was an endless process of being professionalized, like an actor on stage who doesn't know who's going to be the partner in the next play. The whole process of teaming and individuating. And it was, you know, one of the craziest things about this, we all resigned from the medical school after 10 years, went to private practice together, so we had nobody to teach for the next 10 years except each other. And one of the weirdest things about that was how this process would work. I would ask Workington in for the second interview, and I would do what happened this morning, and he would do what I did. And then we would staff the situation. He would say, well, I think probably you're going to have to get the grandparents in because it looks like they're all haunted by the past. And I think probably when you get part way along, the kids are going to get fed up with this, and you should be careful not to let them go because the whole family are the ones that need to be reorganized, not the parents. And I think probably mother's going to want to go on in group therapy after you finish with the family therapy. And he'd list all this stuff, and I'd write it all down like a good secretary. I wouldn't have any ideas. I would just listen, like the doctor was saying. And then we would go to his office, and he wouldn't have any ideas. I'd have all the ideas. I'd be consultant on his family. 4 months later, the family would say, you know, let's have the consultant back in. We aren't getting any place. And we'd get the consultant back in, and Workington would say in his typical way, well, let's read over the staff notes, which we'd done with the family there listening. We'd read over the staff notes. I hadn't done a single one. Typical mother, you know, the old man had his say, now he's gone, we're going to back to where we were before. But the multiple consultants, boy, golly, we've used up almost the whole hour. 3 more minutes.
Dr. Whitaker, I was sitting here thinking, and I had a crazy thought that perhaps the thought was that I would be a consultant someday. And my heart started going like this. And the next crazy thought followed, well, I could be a consultant in a room and my therapist would be another woman working with a family like this. And then I got panic-stricken. And the next crazy thought that followed that was, I hope to heck the family had sense enough to pick the right therapist for them. And then the next crazy thoughts I won't share with you, but I certainly want to thank you for provoking my own crazy thoughts.
I'm glad. Hope it grows. They say in Russia, the speaker can applaud the audience.